Okay, good morning, everyone. Apologies for the delay on this. We were just having some technical issues, as many people do have on Zoom. Anyway, thank you for joining us today for the webinar looking at innovation in the digital age on the back of Q&A's last report, Beyond the Buzz, which we're doing now in conjunction with the FTAHK Association of Hong Kong. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Benjamin Quinlan. I'm the CEO and Managing Partner of Quinlan Associates. I also sit on the board of the FTAHK Association of Hong Kong. Today, I will be joined by two speakers, Evan Schnidman and Benedict Nolans. Maybe by way of background, you could both spend a minute or two introducing each other, introducing yourselves while I put the share screen on.
Absolutely, Benedict, go right ahead.
Okay, so I'm Benedict Nolans. I'm a board member of the FTAHK Association of Hong Kong, and I'm also the Chief Compliance Officer for SE Ventures, which is the innovation arm of Standard Chartered Bank. Before this, I was in a crypto startup called Circle, and before that, I was for that. In fact, just in the banking community. So in total, about 23 years across regulation, innovation, fintech, and then financial services.
And I'm Evan Schnidman. I was previously the founder and CEO of Prattle. Prior to that, I was an academic. I sold Prattle last year to LiquidNet, where I was the head of data innovation for the last year. In the last few months here, I've struck out and done some consulting work in conjunction with the folks at Quinlan Associates.
Yep, excellent. And to give you background, those of you who haven't give you access to this report from me, I think we shared many of the same perspectives around the challenges with digital innovation. So it was good to get kind of pen to paper and publish our ideas. But if you haven't read it, I'll share the link afterwards and you can go into some of the concepts that we look at today in more detail in the paper. So anyway, without further ado, let's just get stuck into today's webinar. And I think we can obviously start with the view around the innovate or die concept, right? And I think there is a in the past few years, this ongoing shift to digital has really led to the downfall of a lot of companies that were once global market leaders in their space. And I think you can see a few logos on here, the likes of Kodak, Nokia, Blockbuster, and MySpace, all of which actually were global market leaders. Like Kodak once had 70% market share and the fifth most valuable brand in the world. Nokia had 40% market share of the global mobile handset market at its peak. MySpace was actually the most active social media account at the time with over 75 million users. But you can see a lot of them face various challenges, from the adoption of iPhones through to streaming services coming out such as Netflix and other challenger social media platforms, that most of them were either spun off, filed for bankruptcy, or just written off as an acquisition overall. So the scale of this decline has been monumentous. And I think one of the important things to draw along the bottom is really the time it took to go from that economic peak to what we call irrelevance. And you can see over time, as digital became more prevalent, that acceleration occurred at a more rapid pace. Evan and Benedict, do you have more to add on this?
Yeah, I definitely want to highlight, I think that speed of decline is only going to continue to accelerate. We've seen a number of innovations in the digital space that have really become prevalent in the data world and really broader computing. And because of that, we're seeing things like Snowflake rise to prominence extremely quickly, and seeing mass adoption. Will be interesting to see is how quickly it forces out some of the incumbent players in the digital infrastructure that may have peaked as recently as a couple of years ago, but might be irrelevant quite quickly.
And Benedict, I believe you wanted to talk about more recent examples on the back of COVID-19.
Yeah, so in the COVID scenario, obviously this is a situation where there is a huge shock, right? So companies that, in a sense, you could say muddled on with the old business model and actually managed muddling on, you can do that in a varieties of ways. For example, you can cut your cost and things like that. But those type of companies, they are now starting to file for bankruptcy, right? So Neiman Marcus is one of them. As we know, that's one of the principal department stores. And also we've seen Hertz file for bankruptcy. So a shock like this can make those who already knew in essence that they were in trouble, it can accelerate that trouble very, very, very fast. That's what we're seeing now.
Yep. Excellent. I think one of the cases that we draw out here is just to give you guys an idea a bit more about BlackBerry's revenue profile. So I think all of us who are over the age of, I would say, 32 or 3 have at some stage held a BlackBerry in our corporate careers. I think that was the staple of every single financial institution's communication device. But you can see this is BlackBerry's revenues from 2004 to 19, so a 15-year time span. And you can see at their market peak around 2011. 2009-10, they actually had about 20% market share in the handset space. That fell to 0% as of today. So you're looking at a revenue profile that's fallen completely off a cliff, and a company that reinvents itself and is just a shade of what it used to be. So just to give you some context on how dramatic those declines be. And I think the important thing here is to really look at the drivers of what's causing this disruption. And everyone knows it's about technology, but we really boil it down to, I guess, 3 core themes in technology, which is data analysis and communication. So data analysis, you're looking at the whole concept of big data, hardware developments, enabling generation of huge information sources. You know, we all carry a device that tracks our spending habits, our movement patterns, and so on. So a lot of new sources of data being tapped into, you know, what were previously alternative data sources are now becoming very mainstream. From the analysis perspective, advancements in cloud, basically ramping up processing power and facilitating a lot more analytics. And I think on that basis, you know, development of AI, machine learning techniques, it catalyzes the development for these more sophisticated analysis techniques. And I think when it comes to communication as the final theme, again, going back to the fact that we are all on social media, that we all have our devices, rapid speed and dissemination of information right now. And what you can see is all of these themes are kind of self-reinforcing, right? Data generates more analysis, which is then
within individual businesses as well, right? So individual businesses are finding themselves having to reinvent the type of analysis they're doing, the way they're communicating, and most notably, the way they're storing and analyzing, and then in turn, analyzing and communicating that data at every turn, because as that multiplies, they can't have the same type of on-prem computing or local machines. They've had to move to the cloud. They've then had to transform what they're doing with that cloud infrastructure. And so it's not just that this is a meta cycle happening across the market, it's actually happening within each individual business, within just about every industry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add 2 thoughts. First of all, on the BlackBerry side, I still remember the BlackBerry. Is very proud of it, actually. But when the came in, what it did is it in fact moved from a device that could only do one thing, which was your office emails, that was the BlackBerry, to a device that could do everything, right? And that is the big change. It's the bundling of everything into one device. And then for a while, it took companies, a lot of companies were still thinking through the security, but of course, new security tools came around this new environment that was being created. And that is really the downfall of BlackBerry. And then in terms of the computer power, in fact, I quoted in a published report a few years ago that a single smartphone has more computing power than NASA had in 1969. So think about what we're dealing with here. It's really huge.
Yeah. So on that point, you can as individuals send people to the moon. All right. So going on to this, I think overall what you've seen is this evolution in the technological landscape and the way that economies have worked means there's an evolution in business models. So if you look at how business models have changed throughout time, you know, the 19th century, this was really about mass production, right? The assembly line enabling mass production of cars, parts, machinery, and so on. You know, that fundamentally changed the way that companies produced and accelerated to scale the production of goods and services, right? And then we entered the digital revolution phase later in the 20th century, the progress of electronics, you know, and migration to cyberspace, particularly the development of the internet. But all of these models were effectively what you call centralized, right? So a corporate model, employees providing those goods and services. It was all fundamentally based around shareholder value and wealth generation for the shareholders. And really data sophistication was quite low because there was a lack of infrastructure and technology or platforms to share the information between corporates. But really, as we entered, I would call it the latter part of the 90s into the 21st century, it was this era of what we call technology fusion, right? It's being incorporated into all aspects of our society and every industry. And in particular, you're seeing a rise of what you have is the platform economy, right? This marketplace model where employees, as well as contributors from the outside, actually generate value for a company, right? So if you look at things like the social media platforms, case in point, stakeholder value. So you're seeing obviously an emphasis shift just from the employees and the shareholders in particular to wider stakeholders in the economy, all the parts or the constituent parts that tie into that business. And as well as that, it's really around this increased data usage, right? Industry, market, and consumer data are being leveraged on a very, very ongoing basis to enhance the operations of the platforms that we use. I mean, that's why when we go search for a holiday, we, you know, go on the internet the next day and bang, there comes that holiday we were looking at as an ad in our face, right? And obviously you've seen, you know, the decimation of many of these corporate-led models and the rise of the Amazons, Netflix, Deliveroo's, and so on, fundamentally changing the way we engage with each other and interact as a society. Benedict, I know you had a particular point around this that you wanted to add.
Yeah, the point I wanted to add is that, again, to the point of the mobile phone, so in terms of smartphones, the expectation is that there's about 3 to 4 billion users in 2020. And again, I quote from a book that I'd also quoted before, but it said very simply, when 3 billion people are connected, they communicate and research very differently. They also socialize, share, build communities, cooperate, crowdsource, compete, and trade in ways and on a scale that has no analogous in the current world. That was written a few years ago. And I still think it's one of the most accurate statements.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Evan, your 2
Yeah,
cents on this?
absolutely. So I think, you know, the most important and most telling thing about this particular graphic is to point out that, you know, Netflix, Deliveroo, Amazon, Uber, Airbnb all share one very important thing in common. They don't actually own the assets in most cases. Netflix does now own some assets. Amazon does own some assets. But generally speaking, they don't own the assets that they're providing the services through. Right? That is the point of this marketplace model. They're no longer spending that capital to hold the assets. They're spending the capital on technology to facilitate each other sharing those assets, right? So it's content that was previously made that people are binge watching on Netflix. Now Netflix has built out its own studio and makes its own content, but look at Uber. They don't own cars, right? And I think, you know, WeWork is an interesting example of how this can both work and not work. And so it'll be very interesting to see in the next 6, 12, 18 months in the post-COVID world, what happens to some of these marketplaces and which ones of them thrive and which ones of them have to reshape their business model as society may be interacting somewhat differently here.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. I'm just thinking Netflix producing their own content. There's a lot of crap that they produce. I think I watched one episode mistakenly of Too Hot to Handle, and my IQ dropped significantly. But anyway, I'll leave that for another discussion. So I think
then I want to add to the prior slide as well. So let's say one that I found in a sense missing on the bottom there of the platform economy is obviously Ali, right? The whole of that group is an example of combining platform and payment, and that is so powerful, right? And if you combine it further with investment and banking, then it's not only powerful, but of course it becomes a totally different form of doing banking, and it becomes a totally different form of competition. Now, obviously, Ali has had the advantage of an enormous population in China, right? But nevertheless, it is a model that I think we will see come up more in the future. And it will then, in turn, of course, reshape banking as well at the end of that evolution.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So, I mean, moving forward with the presentation, I think there is a general recognition from companies, both technology and non-technology, of the need to innovate. I don't want to go into this in any great detail, but whether you're taking the likes of your Intels, IBM, Cisco's on the technology side, through to your GEs, your FWDs and insurance, to even your FedEx, senior management across every industry understands that innovation is something that has to be done, in particular, the journey of digital transformation. So what does this all mean from the perspective of corporate digital innovation spend? So at Q&A, we're trying to work out how much do companies around the world actually spend on digital innovation? And we estimated by the end of 2019, $510 billion were spent by corporates worldwide on their digital innovation efforts. Now, going forward, how do we expect that to pan out? I mean, look, this year is obviously not a great year for many firms. So you're kind of caught at this, I would call it, junction where firms have to actually digitally innovate and become digitally enabled just to survive, right? Because of the lockdown laws and restrictions. If you're not operating online, you're not facilitating activities that are, on the web or on your phone, you're going to be falling behind in many ways. But against that backdrop, you're obviously seeing many companies go out of business, bankruptcies on the rise, and economic situation as a whole not being so great. So we actually forecast that much of the, position over the next year or two will be this reaction phase. So we're going to see innovation spend, so like fundamental change and transformation, falling actually as firms slash their costs, right? But targeted tech spend, so these are things like your virtual meetings, Zoom, workflow tools, rise as companies look to stay relevant. But I think subsequent to this, we believe the world is going to enter a new normal, right? Consumer preferences are shifting dramatically to online channels. A lot of the behaviors that we've been forced into throughout this cycle are behaviors that will stick. Not all of them will, but many of them will. Working from home has become very prevalent. I know a lot of people now are saying, well, I don't need to go back to work. I think you had Twitter even announce no one needs to come back to work for the foreseeable future, right? Digital business processes as a whole have become a lot more institutionalized. And I think as a result of this, the changing landscape of the way that companies do business means that many of them will need to digitally reinvent themselves. So we actually forecast a doubling of that innovation spend by 2025, about $1 billion globally. Big number, but actually we feel much of it will be pissed down the drain, about 2/3 of this spend, because it's being deployed in the wrong way. Now, before I go into this, I think Evan and Benedict, comments on the outlook for digital innovation spend moving forward.
Yeah, I think, in fact, you started with the Kodak example, and people always say, when they face innovation, it's a Kodak moment, but then they kind of ignore it because it's not big enough. But this time, I think with COVID, it's a huge Kodak moment for most businesses, right? So if you didn't have a digital delivery channel at a restaurant, you're in trouble. If you didn't have a digital delivery channel as a fitness club, you are in trouble. If these kind of businesses are in trouble, then you shouldn't be asking yourself whether, for example, a bank that didn't have a digital channel wouldn't be in trouble. Now, luckily though, for financial institutions, they do have digital channels, even let's say the non-neo banks, but then competition nevertheless comes in terms of neobanks and them doing things smoother and faster. are, for example, investment platforms, again, on them offering more transparency, more choice. So the competition is just constantly there. I personally think that COVID, as you say, being locked down for 4 months now, in fact, the key point is that those of the consumers who hadn't yet changed their habit will also have had to change their habits. And that then in turn will materially impact the business models.
Yeah, and I would say, I think, I think this may in fact be the most interesting and important slide we show here, because it's extremely noteworthy that, one, that obviously these firms are spending an enormous amount on innovation, but two, the fact is that it's not just purely on technology. It actually is business and happens to tie into their technology. And as you said, so much of that is wasted. And I found myself just today talking with a friend of mine who's a portfolio manager and a co-founder of a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. And one of the things he said to me is, 3 months ago, he moved out of New York. His office is in New York. His family has lived there for many, many years. He moved out of New York 1,000 miles away to Georgia and bought a house that he has no intention of leaving because they don't need to be in the same confined space, and that the last few months has really shown that they can innovate on their business model to work remotely, and that the hardest thing for him is going to be, how does he train his new personnel? How does he train his analysts remotely? And so I think one of the challenges here is, as this innovation spend continues to increase, there's going to be trial and error, and the places that do it well are going to be efficient about it. But as you highlighted, much of that money is going to get wasted by people who are really not thinking about innovation in an efficient way or in an effective way.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, look, I think this takes us on to, I guess, the next part of this presentation, which is really exploring the innovation concept and the whole idea of waste in a bit more detail. So when you approach corporate innovation, generally two kinds of broad brush questions most companies need to answer, right? Which is one, where can we innovate? That's the whole development behind this. What's the strategies and or tactical initiatives that the company should explore in order to thrive, given new opportunities or, defending potential challenges, COVID-19 obviously being one. And then implementation is really around, how do we actually do it? How do we implement these initiatives in the most effective way? Very logical kind of two questions to ask when going about an innovation process. And strat development, in terms of logically, what could we do, seems very straightforward. I think a lot of this gets lost on how it's actually done, which is the implementation. So delivery actually suffers in the end. Now, here's just a quick kind of snapshot of some common circumstances that we laid out in our report, right? So you can see companies need to ask a couple of strategic questions. So maybe it's let's take the case of an investment bank, right? A lot of the banks and asset managers are going through multiple headwinds from a regulatory perspective. They need to innovate new products, retain talent, adopt fintech. So there's a lot of issues going on in terms of what their priorities are. But from an initiative perspective, many of the regional offices actually look at, I guess, when you look at a business case, which markets to go in. Many regional offices, I've worked in these functions, I know. So they're biased towards presenting the business case that obviously sells their idea or whatever they want to achieve the most. Now, a lot of the limitations that fall across your markets, technology, and products, imagine if you need to digitally innovate and you go and speak to a chief technology officer, and they're obviously looking at, well, my job is to actually build these solutions internally. We might use piecemeal external solutions where it's more relevant, but maybe if I'm fundamentally innovating with an external technology, it doesn't actually bode well for me and my team, right? A lot of things are hamstrung by committees as well. I mean, I used to sit at DB, Deutsche, and I remember we had meetings, and I would go into the meeting and say, what's this meeting about? And they're here to discuss next week's meeting. And we'll do that at next week's meeting. And then after next week's meeting, there'd be another follow-up meeting to discuss the meeting that we just had. So just meeting fatigue just drove me crazy. And it is just obsession with achieving this imaginary consensus was impossible. And then I think as well, the regulatory angle, especially in financial institutions, means that there are roadblocks. So across the spectrum, you can see the problems: lack of objectivity, interdepartmental and regional competition, slow adoption rates, legacy infrastructure problems, no consensus, interdepartmental conflicts, conflicting objectives with compliance. And then as a result of that, the main thread is innovation is just generally loosely mandated from the top down. You know, Claude says, let's be innovative, but it doesn't actually ingrain itself as part of business culture. I'm going to pause on that. I know Evan and Benny are going to have plenty to say on this point as well.
Yeah, so I think one of the key points here is really to hit on the fact that because so often innovation is mandated from the top down, the solution, when you get mired in that bureaucratic nonsense that you just, I think so carefully outlined and so accurately outlined, one of the prevailing solutions is, okay, we can't figure out how to innovate. How do we look like we're innovative? How do we maintain the appearance of innovation? And so there's this impulse to do the easiest things that look like a big lift, but actually don't solve the real problems within that company or within the industry. And so too often the innovation spend gets rerouted into a marketing spend, marketing how innovative the company is, and not actually focusing on solving real problems, whether they be technology or business process or personnel or a variety of other areas. Unfortunately, the incentive structure in too many companies is really to show innovation, not to actually innovate.
Yep. Very true. Harsh words, but something we see time and time again. And it's not true for every single organization, but it's true for a lot, particularly within financial services. So going... But
maybe, and I want to add something to this.
Sure.
Balance this out a little bit. So one thing we have to always realize is that incumbents, the reason there is the word incumbent is because they actually have a standing business model. And sometimes the startups underappreciate that a standing business model is actually something to be defended, right? And in a lot of cases, you're talking about standing business models that make $1 billion or many billions, okay? So what tends to happen in incumbents is that, let's say you have all these standing governance and other processes in order to defend that incumbent profitability of multi-billions, which is not to be ignored, right? Because for a startup to get to the first billion, you know how hard that is. And you know that I think it's more than 95% fail on that path, and fail on the path of ever even reaching maturity, leave alone $1 billion, right? So I think you have to look at it in that context. An incumbent has to have its ongoing governance for its ongoing business lines. Nevertheless, at the same time, it must spur innovation. And then the question is, how do you do that? And we can come to that later, I think, when we're going to talk a little bit more about how innovation can be spurred. But I would say another point to note is that if you are, let's say, an incumbent with a couple of billion of revenue, what tends to happen is that the people in it are very used to doing the same job every day. And that, again, is not exactly how innovation works, because in innovation, you need to do a totally new job, often one you don't even know, and you need to improvise. So we can get to all of this a little bit later again, but I just wanted to point this out because we should not ignore that incumbents are defending, are wanting to perpetuate, and rightfully so, a current profitability.
Yep. No, it's very true. Obviously, you know, the different stakeholders and vested interests at play here means that the protection of your existing revenues is something front and center of mindset. But I think as we go into the rationale or explaining some of the consequences of this, the hindrance to innovation or reinventing your company becomes quite dramatic. So what are the main innovation pitfalls with modern corporate? So, you know, we lay this out in a bit of detail. Evan and I were thinking through what are the key reasons why companies really fail to innovate. First of all, we think, starting from the board, there's just generally no organization-wide strategy developed by a company's board or management team around innovation. A lot of boards appoint a head of innovation. They set up an innovation lab. They do things to basically drive the innovation effort from more of an outsourced perspective, right? So it's not really owning that process and understanding it from the top. Secondly, is this weak institutional knowledge. So this concept of innovation lab, we do kind of dissect a little bit. We make some cheeky comments in our report around the, you know, the guy or lady from Google or Microsoft wearing ripped jeans, t-shirt, foosball tables, a PlayStation 4 in a big office doing really cool stuff. But generally, a lot of these people don't have knowledge of the business. They're usually a technologist with limited business knowledge. And in my experience, actually coming across them, it depends, but many of them aren't necessarily very senior with the commercial experience needed to get the business buy-in. And I think something that actually hampers that process as well is they're largely an influencer. So that's a third point. So they don't have real governance power. They don't sit on, you know, the most senior organizational committees. They operate in relative silos. And as a result of that, there's actually poor business alignment, right? So the ideas and initiatives from the lab, which is point 4, they're generated autonomously a lot of the time. I've seen this many times. They're technology centric, low levels of business engagement, and they showcase these ideas to the business or to internal staff, but they're not designed to actually solve a particular problem, right? If you go to open innovation where you're sourcing startups, a lot of the time the mandate, if you're going through, let's say, a corporate accelerator, is often unclear. I've seen companies hire accelerators to do events where they bring in tons of different startups talking about very random but cool things, but they're not there designed to solve one particular problem or a few specific areas that that particular corporate needs addressed. Some do. But again, I've been and spoken at many that I just think, what am I doing here? It's really a bit too random for me. Problem diagnostics is part number 6. So overriding assumption that technology solves all problems, right? And I've been in so many discussions in my consulting career where someone says, all right, do you know any fintech solutions that can do this? After spending 3 minutes having a discussion, I know immediately that 95% of the problem is a process problem. It's nothing to do with technology. It's just people not having the right behaviors using existing technology, which is actually good enough. And then a lot of the time, I call it, you know, this irrelevant success metrics. Everyone talks about startups raised X amount of money from our innovation day or this and that. It's not like we've adopted these solutions. It might be, yeah, we've had a pilot. There is a lot of that going on, but genuine commercial adoption still remains relatively low. So again, from this, that's just the high level view around the steps of this. We go into it in more detail in our report, but Evan, Benedict, do you have anything to add to this?
I think it's worth re-emphasizing the key point. You hit on it a couple of times, Ben. So, you know, this is the to a hammer, everything's a nail problem, right? So when you bring in that technologist who has the tech background to run an innovation lab, they're going to come in and want to solve every problem they see with technology. But so often the problems facing large organizations are process oriented, that there are veto points within the organization that need to be overcome via institutional means, via the corporate politics, or really actually going through and doing the hard work of diagnosing what a longer term strategy ought to be. That may involve technology, but it may not in some cases. And I think you know, it's a little bit too simplistic to say let's start this cute innovation lab and staff it with some technologists and hope they'll solve all of our problems. I think that the success rate of those organizations is unfortunately been quite low, because there really are real challenges in these organizations. Some are met by technology, but some are not.
Yeah, so I want to emphasize 2 points. So first of all, in terms of, let's say, as a lot of you know, my history was in compliance, and people always said you need a strong tone from the top. I would say the same thing for innovation. If the tone from the top is not there, you can totally forget it. And specifically for something as small as a lab, it will make absolutely no difference. So in the case of, for example, Standard Chartered builders, you can see he talks openly and frequently about innovation. So that is very, very important. And what I'll touch upon a little bit later as well is the need, in fact, the need to create internal competition. If you don't create internal competition and the incumbent is not itself willing to move and innovate, then you're going to make little progress. So a lab, in fact, does not create internal competition. It creates internal assistance, but not internal competition.
Yeah. Okay, good points. So barriers to innovation, what kind of obstacles do firms face when trying to innovate? So I think we can come to a broad consensus that genuine innovation is often quite hard and quite expensive, right? But the barriers that organizations face, we generally find differ largely as a function of size. But we also find that culture remains a key problem. So if you look at innovation barriers, it's the process, right? Firm-wide buy-in, governance, incentive structures, communications, your systems, your budget and your resources. The things that most correlate to the size of the organization, and particularly around your innovation process. So obviously, the larger the firm, it's more difficult to identify the underlying problems. And because there's so many moving parts, the innovation process is often quite chaotic and poorly designed. Less of a problem for smaller firms. But again, if you look across the bottom row, budget resources, you're seeing small firms actually face most of the budget constraints, right, to drive the innovation efforts, but they generally have fewer needs. But in the middle is really everything tied to organizational culture, that tone from the top that Benedict mentioned, right? The governance structures to support it and so on. There is some delineation, obviously, as you get smaller, some of these firms might become, these problems might become less pronounced. But overall, culture remains a major challenge within every kind of organization, almost irrespective of size. And that can be as a result of particularly key personnel, even at small firms, that push back against change. I don't know if there's anything you both want to add to this. I'm just mindful of time as well, so just be aware of that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is the willingness to fail.
Yeah.
So innovation, you fail. As you said, a lot of the money, the trillions that you had put forward may go to waste, but in fact, it's not waste. The waste is if you don't try, right? So as I mentioned, the official statistics are that more than 90% of innovative or new companies actually fail. That's always been the statistic. If corporates can make success 50% of its innovation attempts, that is already nearly double the rate of what happens in what I call the jungle, being the market out there. So I think the willingness to try, knowing that one may fail, is a very important culture to adopt and to learn. And again, in incumbents where people run the same process every day, the same job every day, they've actually unlearned to fail. And knowing how to fail and then getting up again and starting again and trying another attempt is in fact extremely important.
And I'll quickly reinforce that point. I think one of the other key aspects here is of course personnel. So personnel who failed rarely make their way to the top of an organization. And so unfortunately that creates a disincentive for those who want to take that creative leap to innovate, because they know they might fail and that might be a roadblock in their career. So organizations that are successful at innovation are actually successful at empowering people who are innovative and actually putting them in positions of authority. And so I think that's a key component here as well.
Completely agree. And I mean, the point of failure comes up time and time again in the report, to embrace this notion that failure is actually an essential component of doing innovation properly, right? But the incentive structures and the way that organizations, many of today's organizations, are focused on short-term quarterly targets and ensuring that, you know, what you need is reached, that leaves very little room to fail in current corporate constructs. Moving on, I don't think we're going to go through these startup perspectives per se, but is there a short anecdote that maybe you or Benedict want to share on your experience of the challenges of startups working with large incumbents?
Yeah, I'm glad to. I certainly have a laundry list here of challenges, but I think you touched on one of my I think constant or near constant experiences. Really having an innovation day put together, flying in from all over the world, 10 or 20 startups to go speak at a large asset manager, for instance. I can think of one specifically, and spending an entire day pitching to senior executives at a company, only to find out that quite literally in one instance, I was had the profound experience of talking to the chief technology officer of a roughly $1 trillion asset manager, and he pointed literally to a hole in the ground next to the building we were in and said, that hole is where we're going to put our data science building. Once that building's built, we'll staff it with data scientists and we'll be able to make use of what you're selling. And I think that was a really profound moment for me to say, oh, good. That means that our sales cycle is by definition 2 years away. And I think, every other company that presented there had a similar experience. And to my knowledge, not a single company that was at that innovation day got a commercial relationship out of that experience.
Benedict, I guess you see it from a slightly different perspective.
No, I see the same thing. So let's say for SE Ventures, one of the key areas of focus in the early days, when it was primarily focused on the lab, has actually been to ensure that at least the POC cycle is as short as it can be. And one of the key issues was that, for example, the banks would think, oh, they need real data. And if it's real data, then honestly, you're in for the 6-month delay. So if it's not real data, already you can shorten that onboarding cycle. But there are other aspects as well, such as, for example, speeding up the legal process of the contract you enter into for the POC, etc. So, and this long sales cycle thing is a huge issue. It remains a huge issue. And consequently, there often is the question as a startup, whether you should focus on selling to the incumbents or whether you should focus on grabbing market share. I wouldn't say either of them is easy. Both are difficult, but of the two, I still think that if you look around and look at the most successful players of Silicon Valley and globally in the technology sector, they're actually the second type. They're the ones who didn't do the sales cycle through the incumbent. They're not the B2Bs, they're the B2Cs. And people say, okay, that's hard, but I look around, that's the giants we're seeing. And that's the giants that I mentioned at the beginning that will be the real, on the long term of this evolution, will fundamentally change all the business models.
It's an interesting discussion around the B2C, B2B play. I mean, often I remember going in and speaking with some VCs. They were interested in some of the companies we were consulting for. And then they were saying, what kind of companies are these? We were mentioning a couple B2Bs. We obviously like that space because we can add a lot of value as a consultancy. But I think from their perspective is this going to give me 100x? And I thought, no. And they thought, well, that's the end of that discussion. You're actually seeing a lot of these B2C platform plays come under major pressure now because the business models in terms of valuations have been heavily based on user uptake, sign up, and so on. But the underlying economics of many of these platforms isn't necessarily as sound as it should be. I think many of them took a long time to even break even. Many of them still don't make money, right? Look, Benedict and Evan, I think for the purposes of time, just allow me to dance through the last few slides. We'll pause so you can add some comments, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
So I think, how do you get digital innovation right? So develop your firm-wide strategy, board with business, get the buy-in, make sure you're clear about your mandate of what does digital innovation entail for the long term, not for this year, not for whatever, for the long term. Unless you're backing the long-term innovation and change, it will die out very fast. We may have a critique on the innovation labs, but we don't have any issue with regards to centralizing it through innovation leads and innovation heads. You need an impartial person within the business to act as a facilitator, but they need the business and technical expertise. And they need to drive the central coordination of those innovation efforts. They need to be empowered, right? They need to sit on the right committees, right boards. They need to have a say at the table, and they need a ring-fence budget to be able to get things going forward. You can't put it under the same kind of protocols as does this meet a business case for a typical product launch for a bank, right? It's a very different thing. Strengthening alignment. You can even embed them within the business, so they're actually much closer to the proximity of that problem that they're trying to diagnose. And most importantly, step 5, start with business problems, right? You need to start with the problem. Technology is an enabler, and give all the businesses and every employee within the business the empowerment to actually identify these problems and help come up with those solutions together with the innovation leads. Innovation process number 6, extremely important. I think what we see with most firms is that innovation process sucks. Right? Everyone talks about agile, this and that. It's hogwash. A lot of the time I see this and it just doesn't work. And I think that the way that the innovation process works is many times roadblocked by vested interest and power plays, and it ultimately doesn't go through the right kind of process to be done properly. And again, success metrics. How do you determine them? You need to look at commercial adoption rates, and you need to look at relevant ROIs and KPIs that are tied to the business problem that that solution is trying to solve. You can't just make it blanket and generic, right? So as a result of that, one of the important parts is that innovation process, right? So if you go through an innovation process, the design thinking, agile methodology, there's so many different ways to look at this, but our view, you start with the business team identifying the problem that sits outside of that process. You go to a diagnostics phase, right? So problems are evaluated to determine potential requirements for either tech and non-tech. Then you go through an exploration phase, right? To determine the efficacy of solutions out there, again, tech and non-tech. Then if it's a technology related problem, you source it, right? You need to work out, well, what kind of technology can we source? Can we do that internally? Can we do that externally? Is it buy, build, partner, right? And if it's not non-technology problem, you can go straight through to implement, right? Once you actually understand it's a low-hanging fruit, because many of them are. When you source it, you go through your trialing stage. When it's effectively trialed and it's appropriate or suitable, then you can go through to an implementation, right? So this is going to the proof of concept point that Benedict is raising. And after all that's done, it must go through a continuous review with the business, because that's the whole nature of this process. It's dynamic, it's adaptive, it ensures that there's failure contingencies built in, but that you evolve this, this process over time around how you become more innovative. I don't think I need to go through this one, but different models for sourcing that technology when we talk about buy, partner, and build and the trade-offs. Again, you can read in more detail in the report around that. A case study, again, I don't want to go through this in detail, but you can have a read of our report about the case of BlackRock. Among financial institutions, it's probably one of the more successful ones in terms of its digital innovation efforts across all of the various streams of technology. And again, you can read in more detail around that. I think the thing we want to end on is really the overarching considerations to get innovation right. And we bucket this into 4 core themes: your resources, your people, your processes, and your systems. And there are, for each of them, both your internal and external considerations. So for example, your resources, brand reputation externally, and your budget internally. Your people, your customer readiness. What's the point of going digital and doing everything in certain markets where maybe no one has a mobile phone, as well as culture being a big one. Processes, external regulations, internal, your risk and compliance. And then your systems, really it's around your channels, particularly your partners, distribution, your messaging, and then internally it's your IT infrastructure and data. So this, I'll just leave it on this because it gives you a bit more detail around the key questions that firms should be asking within each of these criteria, and what kind of example criteria can come out there. Now, Evan, Benedict, I'm sure because I glanced through some of that, do you have, I guess, additional thoughts or points you want to hone in on regarding what is needed to get digital innovation right?
I think one key aspect I do want to make sure gets highlighted a little bit. The diagram you showed a couple slides back really hit on the flow, yeah, that one right there, the flow of what it takes to actually innovate. And I think that one of the steps in this process is where I see most companies fail, and it's actually the diagnosis. Most companies really struggle to diagnose what their real problems are, and then identify which of those can be solved with technology, right? What does that exploratory phase really look like? And so it's the first three steps in the process is the hard part. And I think too many firms jump straight to, hey, let's source some ideas, trial some technology, and maybe we'll implement it. But if they haven't identified their problems, diagnosed what potential solutions could be, and explored what's out there, they really actually haven't done the hard work internally to know what they should be spending time on. And it's, you know, as a technology vendor, as somebody selling an innovative product, that's actually a very frustrating experience to walk in with the right product to solve a problem, but it in fact is not the problem that organization has. And so I think that if I'm going to emphasize anything here at the end, I think, you know, talking to large organizations about identifying, diagnosing, and exploring as key components of that process.
Yeah. Benedict?
Yeah, so the only thing I would add is that point on internal competition that I raised before. A company is early still on their journey on innovation, or when the buy-in isn't universal yet, i.e. it is only primarily those few people that you mentioned, whether it's the labs or whether it's the digital leads, etc., then creating internal competition is actually quite useful. So I've seen it, I've been in it on 2 occasions. Currently, for example, in SC Ventures, we do create new ventures where sometimes the bank actually doesn't quite think there was an issue, or it's, let's say, they think there might be an issue, but it might not be a priority. And then once you start creating this type of innovation, for example, we launched banking as a service. That's a real good example of this, right? So once you start doing that, then the bank starts looking and saying, oh yeah, in fact, the credit models, the use of data, it's totally different. And that's when it realizes it has a need. For example, as well, we're building environment platform. The bank knew there was a need, but it wasn't very sure how that need would express itself, and let's say how it intersects with other leading themes such as health, you know, and some of what SC Ventures does has led the bank to look more closely at its offering and reconsider it. The last example to raise, of course, I should definitely raise this one, is the digital bank Mox in Hong Kong. It onboards totally differently, of course, quicker. So it's certainly, it's maybe the same business model. It's banking under the banking ordinance of the HKMA, but it's done in a different way. And neobanks, that's the key value that I've added, is totally changing the customer journey. So to create that internal innovation, not just in the form of, let's say, POCs in the lab, or in the form of training sessions, but really in the form of possibly even competing products, is actually quite important.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think there were some comments here. Right, Evan, putting lipstick on the pig. Yes, obviously we're short on time. Unless there's some more fundamental questions. I know there was one around what's the views on what it means for Hong Kong. Is there a Hong Kong specific view on digital innovation spend? Again, like this working from home, it might be more of a challenge. Yes, I agree, but real estate is also one of the most expensive in the world. So I would say many companies that have the opportunity to cut their real estate costs would be jumping at that opportunity right now. And that might change the dynamic of the way that, you know, office environment looks in future. I did a couple webinars around the future of work and what this means. Look, me, home, my staff are at home, you know, it really depends what we feel like, and when they want to come in, they're in charge of how they want to come to work now. So my office is a nice dead weight in terms of cost. But look, in terms of, I guess, today's presentation, if you want to find out a bit more information, please go to the website. You can download the report at quinlanassociates.com under the Insights page. If you have any further questions, You can reach out to us if you're connected to us on LinkedIn. We're happy to have a chat regarding obviously what we do and some of the areas we might be able to help as well. But a big thank you to everyone that joined today. In particular, thank you to my co-author on this, Evan, and appreciate your insights and your very valuable knowledge base when working with me on this report. It was a real pleasure. And then Benedict, as always great to see you on these panels. You provide a very rich view of regulatory investment and then soon to be, innovation hub perspectives on topics like this. So appreciate all of you joining. Thanks very much, and hope to see you at our next webinar sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.